Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful Sabbath day. It is beautiful outside, and I'm delighted to be here with you once again, and hope you're enjoying your weekend and the beautiful weather, and it's nice to see the sunshine. It makes me smile. Did you win the lottery this week? I don't guess anyone in here won the lottery. You know, the odds of winning are astronomical, and it's almost comical to go buy a ticket. But one person, I guess, won this huge, big jackpot, this $1.5 nearly billion, and I wonder how this will affect their life, whether they'll use the money for good or for bad, or I hope that they use this opportunity to do a lot of good things. I thought, well, maybe they'll become converted and they'll start tithing on their income. Maybe that would be a one chance for us to have a boost in our economy within the church. One roll of the dice and their lives were changed forever. Is our life simply a roll of the dice? Are we living here only by chance? Is anything we do based upon, or is everything we do based upon time and chance? Is our destiny based upon outrageous odds that are most likely against us? Or are we on a course that has divine direction? I believe that we largely are given the choice to make decisions based, concerning our daily life. We're allowed choice to freely choose the things that we do. We can choose most of the basic decisions of our life. We're given the choice of what we're to wear. Maybe you like what I wear, maybe you don't. Maybe you don't like the way somebody wears their hair, but that's really their choice. We have a choice of the way we conduct our lives, our behavior, our relationships. We can choose which job we want, our hobbies, and our decisions, as I said, are largely left to us. In Ecclesiastes, it tells us time and chance happen to them all. Solomon realized that it's not the smartest guys that become the most wealthy, or is it the most ignorant that are poor? Or he realized that time and chance happen to all people. Some people it just happens that they are in the right place at the right time. But so then, does God then ever intervene in human affairs to bring about His plan for each of us? Throughout the history of mankind, there have been instances that have been recorded as evidence of God's hand in steering the course of human events. Many people can cite instances in their own lives where they believe God's protection was more than evident, and I can state that in my own life. I could stand up here and tell you certain events that I believe were miraculous protection, in my opinion, that saved me and my family from terrible harm and perhaps even death. Others have told me of these kind of events in their lives, church people, where they felt like an angel protected them and saved them from a certain instant, where they could have been harmed. But even on a larger scale, I'm reminded of stories in World War I and World War II and how the outcome of certain battles turned the tide of war in our favor and allowed our enemies to be subdued and our course for a free democracy to remain intact as a result. One such event is recorded in the Bible, and it remains a testimony to God's divine protection in human affairs. It reminds us of God's hand in delivering His people no matter what may befall them. The story begins in the first chapter of the book of Esther. And it's sort of ironic to me that I did not watch this news this morning about this synagogue being attacked, but I think that it is ironic that I picked this subject today, having given the fact that was in the news. The events surrounding this young, orphan Jewish girl may astound you, but also it may remind you of the great protector that resides over us, of which we are rarely conscious and for the most part completely unaware at times. I'd like to begin in Esther 1 if you will walk with me through this story today. It says, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, that is, Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces." And some of the commentators say that they were just making this claim because it sounded a lot better. But he actually reigned from, it wasn't the modern day India, but it was more the peninsula of Iraq and Persia, down in southern Persia, all the way over to south of Egypt, where Ethiopia of that day was, the provinces of western Pakistan to northern Sudan. And his name, Ahasuerus, is actually, in the Greek, is Xerxes, and you'll recognize that name from history. His name is mentioned in Ezra, the 4th chapter, where, by the way, letters were being sent to Xerxes that were adversaries, if you'll remember in Ezra's day, to try to keep them from building the temple in Jerusalem. This was during his time, and then of course that went on to Artaxerxes, his son, where Ezra went on to build the temple and the wall in Nehemiah's day. It says that in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne in his kingdom, which was in Shushan. Now that city is Susa today. The people that have excavated that area have actually proved that there were sites that have been excavated and pieces that actually mention Artaxerxes there. And it's modern day Susa, which is in Iran, and it was the winter capital of the Persian Empire. It's about 160 miles east of the Tigris River, and the actual place Shushan is mentioned in the book of Daniel. If you remember, he said he had a vision where he was in that temple in Shushan, in the temple there, in the palace, if you will, and that vision began while he was there in Shushan. And we know that Nehemiah actually lived in Shushan during the time when they were carried away captive and in captivity there. And he mentions that in the book of Nehemiah. It says, "In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and servants, the power of Persia and Media." So that gives us the time setting. This is the Medo-Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and Darius the Mede later on. "The nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him." Some of the commentators say that he was planning an attack on Greece. And he had all of these nobles and all of these dignitaries there. And they had this feast that lasted over 180 days. So this was almost 6 months they were together. And it was one of the most lavish events ever depicted in the Bible. He said he showed them the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, 180 days. And when these days were expired, I guess to wind down this 180-day party, they decided to have another party which lasted 7 days. And in those 7 days, all they did was drink. It was a divine order from Ahasuerus himself to have this party where they all drank. And it says down in verse 6, "Where white, green, and blue, and hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple, and silver, and rings of pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon the pavement of red, and blue, and white, and black marble." It was one of the most elaborate, lavish, wealthy events that anyone had ever seen. "And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, and vessels being diverse one from another." It reminds me of the feast in Daniel's day of Belshazzar, where they were drinking out of the golden vessels. "And there was royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king." And down in verse 9, "And Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus." So the women were over here having a big party, and all the men were in this palace, and they were having this big 7-day party. King commanded them bring out the best wine, so in this drunken stupor, the king decides that he ordered his 7 princes to bring his beautiful wife in before this whole assembly. The scripture here tells us that down in verse 11, "To bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on." Some of the commentators that I read said that he only wanted her to wear a crown. That's been depicted in some books and some movies where he actually wanted her to be completely naked with only the crown on to show her off, her beauty off in front of all of these dignitaries. And of course she refused to come forward, and it sent him into a blind rage. Look down in verse 12. It said the king was very wroth, and his anger burned in him, embarrassed him. You know, he got his power tested by his wife in front of all of his peers, and his ego was punctured, and I would imagine that he was so mad, and they looked upon him, and he had to do something to right this wrong. And the king said to his wise men and all of his counselors, what should we do? And verse 16, Memucan, which was one of the princes, above all the princes, he said, this deed, down in verse 17, shall come abroad unto all the women, and that they shall despise their husband in their eyes when it is reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought before him, but she came not. If all the other ladies find out about this, then they're all going to rebel, and we're going to have a women's right movement right here. So they had to put a stop to this. So they sent out this edict, down in verse 19, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all of his empire, all the wives shall give their husbands honor, both great and small. That ought to fix the problem there. This edict here. It's going to make all these wives get in line, start minding their husbands and doing what they tell them to do. So they sent out these letters to all the lands. After these things, the king decided, you know what would be a good idea? I think we'll gather up all the young virgins in the land and let me pick from them. And they suggested that to the king, and he said, that sounds like a really good idea. And down in verse 2 of chapter 2, it says, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. And down in verse 4, and let the maiden which pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. So they were going to select all these virgins to come before the king, and whichever one he picked was going to be in place of Vashti, the queen. You know, in that society, it's a little hard for us to understand. You know, in David's time, he had, wives and concubines, and certainly in Solomon's day, he had many wives, and many concubines actually became part of his downfall. I would make a comment about that, but I will hold my tongue. I'm glad to be married to just one woman. I can't imagine, but this society, women were treated, their place in society was subject to the man, and there wasn't women's rights in these days. And they were, in some of these Gentile nations especially that we're actually reading here of a Gentile nation, they were treated more as property. And their words weren't even counted. Only the man's words were counted. So they decided to do this. Now in Shushan the palace was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Now Kish is in the lineage of Saul. Saul's genealogy mentions Kish, who was a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So these were some of the leftovers that were there in this Medo-Persian Empire who had been carried away. You remember they were carried away by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and they were in captivity. And then in 539, the Babylonian Empire fell and the Persian Empire came to power. This is during the Persian Empire under, as I said, Cyrus the Great and the Medo-Persian Empire, I should say, Cyrus the Mede, Cyrus the Great, I should say. And so this is probably some 40 or 50 years after Babylon fell. And it is during the time when Ezra would be returned. Some of the Jews would be returning back to Jerusalem. Ezra would be making his journey to Jerusalem, and probably before Nehemiah went back to rebuild the wall. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful. So this is an orphan girl, his cousin, that he took in to be his own daughter. It says, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass when the king's command and his decree was heard, and many maidens were gathered together into Shushan, the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also into the king's house to the custody of Hegai, the keeper of the women. She was like a custodian of all of these maidens. And the maiden pleased him, and so she became a favorite of even the custodian. Look down at verse 10. It said, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. She didn't tell anybody she was Jewish. This is one of the best kept secrets in all of the Bible here, and it's going to come. There's a couple of events that happen throughout this story that are critical to the very end and what happened. It is amazing to me when you read through that, there's a couple of these that we're going to highlight that happened that may have seemed somewhat insignificant at the time, but later on they're going to prove to be very critical of the outcome of this story. It said, and down in verse 12, now when every maid's turn came to go to the king Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months according to the manner of women, and they had this purification process that lasted over a year, where they were bathed in all of these fine spices and oils. And it's not unlike, I guess, what, if you were planning a wedding, how long it takes to plan a wedding nowadays. But in this case, they were absolutely bathed in all of these fabulous oils, and they were presented before the king in absolutely perfect condition. And down in verse 14, in the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned to the second house of the women. That they would be sent to the king's house, and then they would go back to another house, which was the place where all the concubines resided. And they were never to go back before the king unless the king asked for them by name. As I said, this was a lot different society in which we live now. And so it happened that down in verse 16, Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house, the royal house royal, in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women. And she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So here's the end of that section. She makes it all the way, and she actually becomes queen. I mean, this is every girl's dream as a little child. Become the princess and actually become the queen and be there before the king. So then the king made a great feast of all of his princes and servants, even Esther's feast, and I guess he named this feast after her. And he made a release of the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. This relationship of Mordecai and Esther became very critical. And here's another event that happens in the middle of this story here, verses 19 through 23, where there was a conspiracy against the king. Mordecai was sitting in the gate of the city, which where all the elders and people with knowledge and the businessmen would stand during the day. And they heard a plot of these two guys that was going to kill the king. Mordecai let Esther know, Esther let the king know, and after the investigation was undertaken, they found out it was really true, and so they captured these two guys and killed them. Mordecai, you know what he received for that? 0. He received no recognition. He received no reward. He didn't even get noticed. And again, this little inset, I believe, is a point that may have been directed by God, as we'll see, that was very critical to the outcome of this story. He wasn't even mentioned. So after these things, the king Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, I hope I pronounced that right, the Agagite. The Agagites, you remember King Agag? Does that remind you of any story in the Bible? You remember in Samuel's day when Saul was instructed to go in and destroy the Amalekites, and he destroyed everything, but he kept all of the finest sheep and oxen, and he preserved Agag alive. You remember what Samuel said? "What is this bleating in my ears I hear of all these cows and sheep? Didn't God tell you to destroy everything, man, woman, and child, and all of the beast?" And of course, that was Saul's downfall when God said, "That's it. I'm rejecting him as king, and I'm going to select someone else to be king." Agag survived that, and I guess he went on to have a family, and this is one of the lineage of Agag. Isn't it interesting? Had Saul done what God had instructed him to do, this guy wouldn't even have been alive here, or his descendants. And yet, we see that descendant coming back in to be a curse, a plague to the people of Israel, and of course here the Jews. He advanced him and set him on the seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate, they bowed to Haman, and they gave him reverence. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. In that society, it wasn't uncommon for Jews to bow before kings. You remember they bowed before David, they bowed before Solomon. There are examples of that listed in the Bible itself. But like some of these Roman Caesars, these Persian kings, they bowed to them and their dignitaries as if they were some divine being. And so Mordecai could not give someone that kind of honor, because he had been instructed out of where God says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." You're not to look upon a man or go after these gods of these other nations. And so Mordecai refused to bow, and it infuriated Haman. Look what it says. "And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not," down to verse 5, "nor did him reverence, then Haman was full of wrath." And again, the human ego comes into play here. Someone gets a little power and a little authority, and you test that authority, boy, you better watch out. I mean, you're going to see the wrath of Haman from some of these folks. "And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai before Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai." So not only did he want to destroy Haman, he wanted to just eradicate all the Jews in the land. And so he went before the king, and they cast a lot. Look here in verse 7. "The first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pure." The Jews today still observe the Feast of Purim. That word comes from this term right here, pure, which means a lot. They cast a lot before Haman from day to day and from month to month to the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. "And Haman said to the king Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are different from all the people." Does that remind you of any other group of folks that you know about who keep laws that are different from everyone else? Certainly the Jews, but even God's people who keep the Sabbath day and the holy days. They're different from all of the others. Neither the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to keep them or let them stay here. You don't need these people. Let's get rid of them. And it pleased the king, and of course the king gave him a great bounty of money to execute this edict. And he gave Haman the authority to do it. And they rolled the dice, and they picked the very day on which they were going to destroy all of the Jews. Down in verse 13 it says, "They sent letters, and in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey." It reminds me of some of the plots down through history, like Pharaoh who wanted to destroy the Israelites, of Gideon's day, of Daniel's day. Remember how they wanted to destroy all of those, certainly Daniel and his kinsmen. And of course Herod, and who wanted to destroy all the firstborn there in in Jesus' day and Nero's day, and of course certainly in modern times, men like Hitler and Stalin and others who were despots that were willing to try to eradicate a whole nation of people. In chapter 4, and when Mordecai received all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put sackcloth and ashes and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud cry. And in every province, whether the king commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. This is a kingdom-wide cry to God by these Jewish people. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told her, and the queen was grieved when she saw that Mordecai was out there in sackcloth and ashes. She didn't know what the edict was, and so they called someone and sent them to her and told her what was happened. And they gave, down in verse 8, and they gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given to Shushan to destroy them, and showed it unto Esther, and declared it unto her, and to charge her that she should go into the king to make supplication unto him, and to make a request before him for the people. There was a law in the land that no one, without being summoned, could go in before the king. I mean, the law was death, with one exception, that the king's scepter was tipped toward them. If he didn't do that, he didn't have to say anything. If somebody just came in before the king without a reason or without being summoned, it was instantaneous death. And it included these concubines. But they're asking her to go in and make a request. The second thing about this king and his edict is, once a king gives an edict, he cannot back out of it. It is a edict. It came out of the king's mouth. He signed it. He cannot go back on his word, no matter what. So the Jews find themselves here in a very precarious situation, having this death sentence over their head. And all the king's servants and the people of the province did know that whatsoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the into the inner court, who is not called, their one law is to put him to death, except such to whom the king should hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. And she said, but I have not been called to come under the king these 30 days. She had been there in that house of the concubines. He hadn't called her. And some of the commentators speculated on the life of a king of Persia, what it must have been like. I mean, he probably would rather have had her in the last 30 days in his palace. But the business of all of these dignitaries and keeping the peace in all of these 127 provinces, and the foreign policy that he had to deal with, and the defense, it probably absorbed all of his time. And Mordecai makes this statement to her, commanded to answer Esther, and he tells her three things here, and these I really want to focus on. Think not with yourself that you shall escape in the king's house more than all the other Jews. Do you think you're going to survive this? When they find out you're a Jewess, you're going to suffer the fate of the rest of the Jews. The second thing he says, for if thou altogether hold your peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. If you don't do this, God is going to pick someone else in his hand to be a tool in delivering his people, because of God's promises that he made to his people. But you and your father's house shall be destroyed, and who knows whether you are come to the kingdom for such a time as this. I'd like to pause here for a minute and ask this question. Was there a reason why you were born? Obviously, Mordecai is telling Esther here, this is the reason that you were born, for this moment. I ask the question, is there a reason why you were born? Had the events in your life prepared you for a moment in time when you might be called upon for a great purpose? Will there be a time when you might have to lay aside all of your own personal plans, goals, or whatever to fulfill a purpose in the plan of God Certainly Esther had to make that decision here. There have been those who have felt that they were called for a great and mighty purpose, and that all the events of their lives had led them to that moment. I know that George Washington certainly felt that way. Winston Churchill certainly did. He even wrote that he, at the age of 16, thought that someday a great power was going to invade and he was going to defend London at a very early age. And when after all of his lifetime of failures, when it all came down to him being prime minister at the height of World War II, he believed that it was divine providence that he was there at that moment and at that time. Abraham in the Bible certainly felt that way, and I know Moses did and Jeremiah did. They were called of God for a great purpose. Jesus said to Pilate on one occasion, remember Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you a king?" And he said, "You say that I'm a king? To this end was I born." Jesus knew that he was there, he had been selected, that he was born for this great purpose. So let's continue here. It says down in verse 15, "Then Esther bade them return Mordecai to this answer, Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, and night or day." And of course, this is one of the biblical definitions of a fast, not to eat or drink. And they did it, on the Day of Atonement for 24 hours. But she commanded them for 3 days that they not eat or drink. "And I also and my handmaidens will fast likewise. And so I will go unto the king, which is not according to law. And if I perish, I perish." I've read stories of people who stood there at the moment of their death, right before their death, when they were being tortured, burnt at the stake. And some of these people's stories absolutely, they defy my understanding of faith and what it means to say, you know what, my life is not worth a dime. My life is not worth anything if I can't have God Almighty in it. If I can't have Jesus Christ in my life. If someone tells me that you must denounce Jesus Christ and denounce God, it's better for me to die. And she's making that claim here. It's better for me to die than to denounce my people who are God's people, God's chosen people, and to live another few years in luxury. So now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on a royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter, and said to the king then said the king unto her, "What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is your request? It shall be even given thee to half the kingdom." What is it with these guys? You remember that was in John the Baptist's day. They made that same promise when she was dancing, before the Caesars there. "I'll give you half the kingdom if you'll just dance for me." And Esther answered, "If it seems good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day into a banquet that I have prepared for him." So she's inviting the king and Haman, who is their enemy, to a banquet. And so they made haste to do that. Well, Haman gets word of this, and he realizes he's been invited by the queen and the king to come to this royal banquet. And so down in verse 9, and when Haman went forth that day, went Haman forth that day joyful and was glad at heart. And when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. It doesn't matter to this guy that he has had an invitation from the king and the queen personally to attend this banquet. The fact that Mordecai is still there and still won't bow down to him is still under his skin. Look what he says down in verse 13. "Yet all that availed me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." He was on his way to this banquet, to this great invitation, but it was still eating him alive that Mordecai was alive. Then said Zeresh his wife and all their friends, let a gallows be built 50 feet high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, and Mordecai may be hanged. So that was his plan, to go in before the king. And here comes the third event. It is the recollection of Mordecai's salvation, or saving the king from the plot against the king's life. The king here has a dream. We were talking this last night or this morning about dreams, and sometimes we have these vivid dreams and we don't understand what they mean. Sometimes they're bizarre, and I know a lot of this comes out of our subconscious mind, things that happen to us during the day. Psychiatrists or psychologists will tell you that, sometimes things in your dream have certain meanings. I believe that this dream here was not by accident. The king in that night could not sleep because of this dream he was having. And so he got up, and in the middle of the night took out these chronicles that he began. He summoned someone to come in and begin to read to him out of these chronicles. And he found written in there that Mordecai had been a major player in saving the king's life. And he asked him, he said, what was done unto this man for this great deed? And they said, there has nothing been done for him. And the king said, okay. So the next morning at this gathering here, look down in verse 4. King said, who is in the court? And Haman was come into the outer court of the king, and to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said unto him, behold, Haman stands in the court. And the king said, let him in, let him come in. And Haman came in, and the king said to him, what shall be done unto a man, or the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought, surely he's talking about me. But actually Haman was talking about Mordecai. Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom the king delight to do honor more than to myself. Who could be better to deserve more honor than me? And Haman answered the king, give him a royal apparel, which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides upon, and a crown royal which is upon his head. And let his apparel and his horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with all whom the king delights to honor, and bring him on horseback through the city to the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And the king said, good idea. Make haste. You go gather up all of these things, and you go give Mordecai this honor. You talk about pouring coals on somebody's head now. This must have just humiliated him. Here, Haman begins to see his plans crack, and his plan begin to fall apart. Now remember, he's built a 50-foot gallows out here to hang Mordecai on. Chapter 7, as I said, his plan begins to deteriorate. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said unto Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, what is your petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted you. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to half the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and be it pleased the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, and I am my people to be destroyed, to be slain and to perish. But if we have been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he that does presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy. I like those choice of words there. The adversary and the enemy, and which this wicked Haman is, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. The king was so furious, he went out into his courtyard. And when he came back, he saw Haman laying across the queen's bed. And he says down in verse 8, will you even force the queen also before me in the house? And he ordered that Haman be carried out and hung on the gallows. Look at verse 10. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. What follows in the remaining chapters of this, we find that Mordecai was raised to an exalted position, that the Queen Esther was also given a high place in the society there, that was allowed to give the Jews of their day, freedom. They also were given the authority to go out and actually destroy a great number of the enemy that had plotted against the Jews, that were a part of the plot to destroy and to annihilate many of the Jews of that day. And it reminds me of after World War II, when they sought out all of these military leaders that were a part of all these death camps and actually put them on trial, and many of them, some of them committed suicide, and some of them were put to death by hanging. It is no small thing here that I believe that God played a great hand in protecting His people. And one of the points that I find fascinating here is, even though the king's edict could not be broken, the way that they were able to get by with his edict not being destroyed was to destroy the one who was going to kill the Jews. And so God's plan was not thwarted. In Psalm, the 3rd chapter, I want to read a few Psalms here. Psalm 3, down in verse 8. Psalm, the 3rd chapter, down in verse 8, it says, "Salvation belongs unto the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people." And then over in Psalm 98, it says, Psalm 98 and verse 2, "The Lord hath made known His salvation. His righteousness hath He openly showed in the sight of the heathen." Here God, just like He did back in Pharaoh's day, showed that He was in control. Even though His people were in captivity, God showed that He was still in charge and that He was watching over them. In Psalm 103, a few pages over, down in verse 19, it says, "The Lord has prepared His throne in heaven, and His kingdom rules over all." If there ever is a doubt, when you read through this story here about God's authority and God's power to change the course of human events, to direct His plan and His path, we may not see that in the things that happen to us day to day. Events may happen in our life that we don't think are significant at all, but they may be something that prepares us for something yet future. Wouldn't that be something to see? Psalm 21 for the last psalm here, 121 I should say. Psalm 121. David writes this psalm here about God's sustaining power. He said, "I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, from whence comes help. My help comes from the Lord which made heaven and earth. He will not suffer your foot to be moved. He will keep you. He that keeps you will not slumber. Behold, He that keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade upon your right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth, even forevermore." I'd like to close with the last scripture here. It's in Proverbs, and down in chapter 16 and verse 33. Proverbs 16 and verse 33. "The lot is cast unto the lap, but the whole disposing there is of the Lord." Who knows what events may take place in your life? Sometimes even seemingly insignificant events may be preparing you for something yet future, when God may deem it necessary to reveal His great will and use these experiences for His purpose. I hope and pray that we will have the courage and the fortitude to stand before the great challenges we may face, and like Esther, shine as a patriot for God's people. She truly revealed her great character and her willingness to jettison all selfish motives and to serve the people of God, even if it meant giving up her own life. What a marvelous child of God she will someday be. I tell you what, I can't wait to meet her. How about you?